Thank you. Welcome. My name is Kristen Sidorovich. My session is called Meeting Them Where They Are, Supporting Student Learning Differences. So the first thing that I want to share with you this morning is just a little bit about myself. Um, I was a special education teacher for 15 years, mostly at the high school level. I worked with students who receive special education services, as well as students in the general education curriculum, since we used an inclusion model. I had the opportunity to plan for many subjects, including English 9, 10, 11, and 12, government, biology, algebra 1, algebra 2, as well as different intervention classes. My work with adults over the last couple years since I switched over from working in a high school to working with adults has definitely been informed by these experiences. And I feel like I cannot hide it, how much I love working with students. And even just being here with you all on this gray Saturday morning, it's that same like feeling I get every day. And I think that is probably my number one instructional strategy or thing that I can, like, if somebody's like, what can I do? Um, just be excited and welcoming. And I feel like that often just opens the door for students, and we can get into whatever it is we're doing. But I just kind of wanted to throw that in there now. All right, so I finally got my whole thing set up, but we are actually going to switch in one moment because I have a few questions for all of you. So in the chat, I am putting a link. We can try it this way. If anybody would like to do this on their phone, give me 1 second and I'm going to share. Where did it go? Hold on, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and find my thing. But you can click on the link that will take you to the Slido, and there is a question there. So give me 1 second to stop sharing and let me share my, okay, here we go. Share screen. All right. Present. Okay, so you can also use the QR code if you prefer. So go ahead and take a minute and just tell me, who are your students? And then I have two other questions just to get us started. All right. Is anybody having trouble?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to change for me. I have somebody else's percentages up. Should I have that up?
You're just seeing, yeah. So what you're seeing on the screen is just what everybody is voting. And
Okay.
so it's just like a cumulative, kind of like a pie chart, but instead of pies, they're lines.
Okay, should I go into the chat and do it then?
No, that's okay. If you want to, if anybody is having trouble and you just want to share who your student is, that's fine too.
Okay, I have one student who I guess would be an adult basic education student.
Okay. All
And
right.
then three who are English as a second language learners.
Yeah. Okay, great. Awesome. All right. Anybody else having trouble and want to share verbally? Okay, great. All right, so I'm just looking at the results. Yeah. All right, so it's kind of a mix there. Very cool. All right, here's another question for you. How do you provide instruction? Is it in person? Is it virtually? Or is it a little bit of both?
Hmm.
Okay. I figured it might also be a mixed
On
bag
Zoom.
here. I know it's mixed for me, so I thought other people might also have a little bit of both, or sometimes it's one just because of availability and scheduling. But
And I'm
okay.
just on Zoom.
Okay, great, great, great. And I feel like and sometimes just hearing this out loud, teaching in person and like teaching online or on Zoom are two different like animals, right? So it can be sometimes more challenging to do one or the other. Sometimes things work in person when maybe it's not going to work so well on Zoom, or vice versa. All right, here's one more question. How long have you been a tutor for Literacy Pittsburgh?
2 to 4 years.
Okay. Okay. Everybody has voted. Okay. Great. Thank you for your service and for being a tutor. I obviously have not seen all of you in action, but the work that you all do is incredible. So thank you for that. Okay. All right, let's jump back over to the PowerPoint. Give me 1 second because I'm gonna see if I can set it up first. Okay. Okay, there we go. Everybody can see my slide, yes? Yes, okay, just making sure. All right. Okay. Just fixing my screen again. Sorry about that. Okay. So now that you all had a chance to share, we are going to dive into our conversation. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the instructional process. And so when I think about the instructional process, I generally see it as four parts. So I think this picture is pretty accurate because the process sometimes seems never ending, or like multiple like circles like this are happening all at the same time, and they're overlapping with each other. But learning is cyclical, right? So it's just constantly going up and up and up. And sometimes we may run into a little bit of a roadblock, but finding ways around, over, under that roadblock are some of the things that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So this cycle can also have different starting points. So at Literacy Pittsburgh, students take like the TABE or the Best Plus, right, to kind of get started. And then we dive into some instruction, but we are constantly using the information that students provide to as different forms of assessment to kind of help propel or figure out where we are going next. Okay. So this takes us to one of the sections, and for the purposes of this conversation, I'm gonna jump around a little bit. I'm not gonna talk about them in one specific order, but we are going to start with the planning for instruction. And so I feel like frequently we think of this question: what will I teach? Right? And so figuring these things out, no matter what subject it is, whether it's, language arts or math, or you're teaching English as that second language, whichever, we're trying to figure out the content, the vocabulary, the skills, right? What things should my student know first before I introduce this other thing? Okay. So even though this is true, there are so many other questions to consider, and thinking about who my student is, like what do they personally need? How do they learn best? Are they a visual learner, auditory, kinesthetic learner, or is it a combination? Or how do I even know that? That's okay. If you're like, I'm not sure. um, we'll talk more in a moment. So thinking about like, what is their prior knowledge? when we're talking about how we are going to cover information. Maybe one student, it makes sense to give this information about a specific topic, but for another student, maybe I'm going to present it in a different way because it makes sense for them. And that is 100% all right, right? So just meeting them where they are. Um, and then thinking about where will we start? So I know from my work over the last year, I have a lot of students who get really nervous and they are unsure and they come in and it's like, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, we're gonna do it. I'm gonna do this today. But it's just like the thinking about what they talked about in that first session with the fixed mindset. Um, they are often stuck, and giving them some tools to think about their learning in a different way so that we can take those like first steps out of feeling stuck into another place. Maybe it's not quite sure what that place is, but that's okay because we are no longer just like, I can't do this. Although sometimes that kind of cycles back, right? But we definitely think about these things. Okay. So, yeah. So my next part to talk about is the assessment piece. And so we are thinking about what we are going to teach. And so moving into here, often I look at the TABE results, I look at the Best Plus results, and there is so much information. And, I go to share these results with my students, and it's just like, sometimes I get that look like, whoa, this is a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. So we have to use other tools to help us kind of pinpoint what we need to do. And so I'm going to share my next slide just because it gives us the two sides here. So um, working with adults, whether it's whole group, like classes, like in a school setting, or individually or in a small group, like you may be doing at Literacy Pittsburgh, it can be very data driven. And sometimes people are like, data. But other times it is very informative. And so the data that I'm talking about here is just the daily things that I learn about my students to help me know what we're going to do next time. And so, in terms of informal assessments, it's not systematic like the TABE or the Best Plus, where there is a standard in this like benchmark, but rather I am just giving some different measures to kind of see where students are in their understanding and learning. So examples of these things would be observation, right? We do this all the time. Having conversations with the student. And then either I often am jotting down notes and I'm telling them it's like, oh, let me write this down because I'm going to want to think about this, right? Just to put my thought process outside my head so that they can see kind of what's going on up here too. And then obviously work samples. And so we can use this in different ways. At the beginning of a topic, I have a group of students that have been spending a lot of time on fractions. And so at the beginning, giving them, one part of fractions. So it's like, do you know about improper fractions and switching to mixed numbers or switching it back to, improper fractions? And some of them are like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. And then they tell me real fast. And it's like, okay, cool, we can move on. But then other students are like, what is that? And it's like, okay, cool. So let's pause here. Let's talk about what this is and give them the time to kind of work through these things before moving on to something like adding and subtracting fractions, where you're going to need to use these prerequisite skills, right? So and it can look different depending on what we're teaching and reading, or even with social studies, sometimes asking questions about like historical events, because maybe they know about this thing in history um, for some reason or another, but then something else they're like, oh, I've never heard of that. I don't know that word. And so maybe we have to take a deeper dive there. So using assessment in those ways. Okay. All right. So this brings me to well, I'll call it a case study. So I have a student, okay? This happened to me for real. And he had trouble doing these things. So identifying individual sounds of letters or blends when given a written or spoken word, spelling words, consistently identifying words that are decodable, recognizing when or spoken sounds when they are the same or different from another spoken sound that I would give him, and then using sounds to kind of like delete a sound at the beginning. So like with cat, can you take off the k sound? And he would stare blankly at me. And it's like, okay, okay, not a problem. Um, and kind of taking it back to figure out what I need to kind of do for this particular student. So the people that we meet and the people we work with, it can be very, very varied, right? So sorry about the repetition of that syllable there. But using our observations and work samples to kind of figure this out. So I notice these things, and sometimes maybe people are looking at this and they're just like, what do I do? Or maybe it's another set of behaviors that you notice in your student, and you're just like, I have no idea what to do with this person. So for this particular student, I feel like a very common question to ask would be, is my student dyslexic? And maybe, but I can't make that determination. Even as a special education teacher in the public school system, couldn't make that determination. So there I was working in when we would have like IEP meetings, and I would prepare all of the documents, but it was a team decision. And so many people were coming together to kind of figure out what is going on with this particular student. So for something like dyslexia, it requires a formal evaluation done by a trained professional. So again, not me, but I have other avenues to figure out what to do with my students. So I don't know if anybody else is experiencing maybe this challenge, but I just kind of wanted to focus here for a moment, and then we're going to move on to other things. But in terms of this specifically, thinking like, well, what do I do now? And so I kind of just felt my way through based on just what I know about the reading process. And again, students who are coming in, their experiences are different. As teachers, as tutors, as people who are providing services to students, our experiences are different too. And that's okay. So I used a couple different informal assessments. So I don't need to be a trained professional, right? I don't have to have a special license to do this. But I asked some informational questions. Tell me about your schooling experience. Can you describe what like a reading class was like for you back when you were in elementary school, middle school, whatever. I also use something called the Ultimate Phonics Reading Fluency Test. Now, I this if you go check it out, you'll see that it is like lists and lists of words, and they are organized by like the sound. So it kind of goes through using short vowel sounds, long vowel sounds. There's like kind of like a hierarchy of the words to kind of introduce in order. And so The cool thing about the Ultimate Phonics Reading Fluency Test is that there is a pretest, and you do not have to be trained, and it is free. So in my slides, I'm guessing that I will be posting these somewhere, but you'll have the link to that if you're interested. Okay. Two other things that I used were the Dolch sight words, which is a combination of decodable and irregular words. And then the other thing, just for reading purposes, and then words their way spelling inventory. Again, both of these things are also free. There are many versions of this out there on the internet, but the words their way spelling helped cue me into what sounds he was hearing and then how he was transferring those sounds to symbols or letters on the page. And so it gave me a lot of very useful information. So depending on the student, like I said earlier, for math, like if I was looking to kind of gain some information, I would use other informal assessments. It could be as simple as giving them 10 problems, or having them like giving one problem. Sometimes sometimes students, whether they're kids or adults, they are like, whoa, that's too many. I'm not doing it. But if I hand them one, they're like, okay, yeah, I can do one. And so sometimes thinking about that 10 set or set of 10 problems, excuse me. Also, I've written them on note cards so I can present one note card at a time rather than handing them a worksheet that might be overwhelming, especially if it's like the first time or the second time that we're meeting. Okay. All right, so I'm checking to see how we're on time. Okay, so I'm gonna move forward. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or save them for the end. But we are gonna move on to the next section, which is providing instruction. So I'm gonna jump there now. So providing instruction, like I mentioned earlier, thinking about what we're teaching. But for our conversation today, I'm going to focus more on those other questions that we talked about earlier, thinking about how I can support my student. And so we are going to start with some general instructional strategies. Okay. And this, I feel like after the first session today, I heard some things that I was like, oh, right, I will add that here. And so at the end there, you see, I think Nicole said, playing games, super important. Absolutely. I love to make up different games to play with my students, and providing that feedback. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But just to kind of go through the list from the top, I'm not sure if you've seen these things before. So, and if people have specific questions about these, on the slide, just because there's not a whole lot of space there, I didn't define them. So I can run through and do that now. Or if somebody has one that they want me to specifically talk about, I could do that too. But I'll just kind of start with that first one. So for activating prior knowledge, here's a quick example. I covered a couple math classes on Zoom recently, and one of the students said, I do this differently. I don't do it that way. And I could just tell from her voice that she was like, I'm not going to budge on how I do this. And maybe I don't belong here. I kind of felt like that's what she was saying when she said, I do it differently. And so it's like, oh, okay, not a problem. Can you tell me about your process? And so I'm taking that basketball and I'm putting it back in her court, right? So, and she's like, oh. And so it took her a little bit of time to find her words, but she did. And she was like, well, first I do this. Okay, well, what do you do next? And so she walks me through, and I'm able to, because like I said, we're on Zoom. So I'm like writing down what she's saying on the screen, and then I'm like going through the steps of the problem. because she was having a little bit of trouble with like the technology and just felt better telling me, and then I would put it on there. But so she goes on and she's talking about how she prefers adding and subtracting fractions vertically rather than horizontally. That was a game changer for her. So it's like, all right, we could do that. Not a problem. Let me move all of my problems around, right? Um, oh, hold on one second. I lost my notes. There we go. Additionally, she was not going to borrow when subtracting when you needed to borrow. So instead, with I'm specifically talking about fractions. So I was like, well, have you done it this way? And she didn't really recognize the term improper fractions, but that's how she did it. And it was like, okay, great. So let's practice a few of those. Okay, now let's look at the problem. And I felt like it was a complete change for her. She automatically was just like opened like up, and the tone of her voice changed, and I knew that I was on the right track. And so then it was just like I could start asking more challenging questions. Nothing too serious, but within reason, just to kind of get her to take another step forward. Okay. Um, I'm going to just ask, is there anything on this list that anybody has not heard of? Because I'm afraid that I'm going to run out of time, and I want to make sure that if there's something specific you would like to hear.
Maybe talk about integrated activities. That's such a general term. I don't know what.
Yeah, that's okay. Great question. And so here, like you said, general. So and I'm keeping it pretty general here. So I'm going to give a specific example for this. So I'm also working with a group of ladies who are studying social studies, and we had been doing social studies content for a while. And they kind of had mentioned, hey, I think we want to do some math. Okay, cool. So we were talking about the we had done European exploration. Well, we had talked about like indigenous peoples, in the what is now the United States, and we talked about European exploration, and then we talked about the colonists and the colonies, right? And so it felt like a good time to introduce mean, median, and mode. And so I went out on the internet. I found an activity. I made it like my own, but we ended up doing like practicing finding the average, finding that middle number, and finding the number that is the most in a data set. And so taking social studies and so specifically looking at populations in the colonies, I think it was like in the 1800s, and then doing a mean, median, and mode activity. And so first I gave, I modeled with just a standard problem. And then we talked about the example from history specifically, so that we could introduce this idea. So later when we are doing math things, maybe they already have this concept. We don't need to dive deep into it because there's no context. And so it made more sense to talk about it in relation to something historical. Another example is we were studying, and I'm really only doing like a day's, like, so about 1.5 hours worth of instruction. And I was trying to find a way to talk about the Civil War, but in a way that maybe is different than what they remember from high school. And so I went out on the internet again, and I found all kinds of graphs, pie charts, line graphs, bar graphs, so many different things. And we looked at commerce and population and other factors, looking at the North and looking at the South, and kind of comparing the graphs to make some conclusions or inferences about what was happening in those states or colonies at that time. So I guess they were states. Yeah, they were states. But at that point, just to kind of give them this reference point. before we talked about it, I gave them a reading. They read the reading just to have, you know, if they needed a little bit of background to kind of place themselves in history, and then let's do this activity. And so it was definitely like, if I feel like it didn't have that traditional boring feel that sometimes history lessons have. So it was more about application. And so just pulling math into social studies, I feel like that is one of the easier routes to go if you're thinking about integrated activities. There are other ways. My group has not specifically started studying science yet, so I haven't gone down that path. Okay. Any other specific questions about any of these strategies? Okay, I'm gonna just share my feedback. So my favorite thing is I say, I really like how you blank. And then I insert something. And then I pause because I don't want to follow up with my feedback too soon. I like kind of feel it out. Sometimes it might be 1 minute later. Sometimes I might say other things, and then I might provide feedback a little bit later. But I always ask a question to help guide them to what they need to be doing, like whatever the kind of the thing was that's sticking, like a sore thumb sticking out at me, maybe, is like, oh, okay, well, so how do you blank? Or what is the next step here? Or is there something we can do with this? Or is there a different word that we can use here? And so just really modeling the thought process that I would have if I were thinking about it, you know, for myself out loud, to kind of guide them to be like, well, okay. And then they start talking. So then I find that it's significantly easier to kind of throw in maybe some advice or my own ideas, because I've already got them talking and we're on like positive ground here. And so it's not that like negative feel like, oh, she wants me to do what? It's more about like, well, what do I have to do next? And so just kind of, you know, um, not, I guess, stomping on them, right? So, all right. Any questions about that? Okay. Leah, I feel like I've been talking and talking and talking. How much time do I have left? I forget what the schedule
Your
said.
time is 10:49, and I'm not
Yes.
sure if the session ends at 11 or not.
Okay, hold on 1 second. I'm just gonna look because I have the email open in my, yep, there it is. Yes, 11 o'clock. Okay, then I am gonna move forward. So like I said, I'm guessing that my PowerPoint is going to end up somewhere maybe on SharePoint. So even if we don't talk about everything specifically here, it should be there just for you to kind of reference. So I'm going to jump through the next set of slides pretty quickly. I have some specific learning strategies for reading, math, writing, and English as a second language. And so these, like I said, this is a very short list. It's really things that have just popped into my head over the last month since I started planning this presentation. So for reading, here are a few things. Using multiple readings, big six reading strategies, which are pretty, I think, commonly used. I have a tool, I guess, or a resource that I'll show you here in a moment. Figuring out what the informational text structure is. So is it defining? Is it description? Is it compare and contrast? Problem solution? Because if students can recognize, oh, that's this, then it leads us to something else. And then writing summaries with the question words. So sometimes they struggle. It's like, okay, well, who's this about? Okay, good. Let's write that down. And sometimes they need me to write that down at the beginning, and that is absolutely okay. And it's like, what is this about? Okay, where, when? And so after we do this a couple times, then they're like, oh, I got this. I don't even need to write it down. Okay, cool. You know, and so then they're able to kind of go through that, whether it's on paper, like just looking at the list of questions. Maybe they have to write it down to start, but then they can just look at it and then it turns into being an internal structure in their head, and they don't have to write it down anymore. And, you know, it could take time for some people. Other people might be like, oh, I got it. And, you know, so just being cognizant of, you know, that, just because everyone's different. All right. Any questions here specifically? Okay. So this is something that I made for the Big Six reading comprehension strategies. I had when I was a high school teacher, the one thing parents would say, what can my student do? And I would say they can read for at least 20 minutes a day. Okay, let's start with that. They may be just kind of getting by in homework, but if they can read, choose to read for 20 minutes a day, that's a starting point. And so that is the same thing that I tell my clients now. Anything, I don't care what it is to start. It could be a newspaper article. It can even, I'm hesitant to say that it can be something on your phone, like on social media, but if that's where you need to start, that's where you need to start, right? And so just giving them the freedom of choice. And then once they're like, oh yeah, you know, they're telling me about the things that they've read, it's like, okay, moving forward, maybe pick an article. I have a bulletin board with some articles hanging on it, but you know, same thing on the internet, or directing them to a website, or talking about things that they're interested in. Let's go find an article, because then it's very self-directed and the buy-in is better. Okay, but thinking about the Big Six reading strategies, once they did those first two things, it's like, here is this. Okay, now as you read, I want you to pick 2 or 3 of these things, and you can absolutely start with the easier ones: predicting, connecting, and questioning. So start there, and then we can kind of, if needed, we practice, you know, clarifying, visualizing, and evaluating. Some students may need to only have one of these at a time. Cool, that's okay too. Cut the paper up. What does it matter, right? Or only show a piece if you're on Zoom, or put it on a slide or whatever. Because maybe they need specific direct instruction in that strategy until they get comfortable. Then they're like, okay, cool, you've got this one. Let's add this one to your repertoire, right? So just trying to get a feel for where they are. Okay. So again, this is something that I think that I can put out there for all of you to share, or to share with you. Okay. All right, so then a couple of things for math. And like I said, I'm not going to talk all of them. Something that sticks out to me is I never knew the rounding rhyme. I don't know if you all know, but the 4 and below, let it go, 5 and above, give it a shove. I didn't learn that until I was teaching math at the high school level. And just a couple weeks ago, I was like, hey, do you know that rhyme? And I said it, and she was like, no, I know if it's bigger than 4, it gets one more. And I was like, whoa, I didn't even know that existed. And so it was just like activating that prior knowledge, because she probably had not thought about that in probably 15 years. But here she is spitting it out because it was stuck in her long-term memory, right? And so using different things like manipulatives for math if needed, just so they can see it. And I know sometimes students are very hesitant to use their fingers. I would say, you got the manipulatives, use them. Who cares what anybody else has ever said? If that's what you need to do right now, it's fine, you know? And I always tell them that I hated math when I was in grade school. I was terrible at it. And I only really started to like figure it out when high schoolers started asking me, like, Miss, I need help with this. Like, I don't want to go talk to my math teacher. I want to talk to you. And it's like, okay, let me go watch some Khan Academy videos, right? And so same thing here. If I am vulnerable and I show them that, like, hey, I had trouble with this too. It's okay. Then again, it opens that door, because, you know, we're not perfect and we aren't all knowing, and it takes work. And I think it's important for them to see that. So some writing things. The one thing here that I'm going to point out is the tied paragraph structure. This is something that a teacher that I worked with had come up with, and there are other organizational structures out there. We found that this one worked because it requires you to provide that evidence. It's very clear about what you are doing. So writing that topic sentence, providing a short summary leading up to the evidence, giving a quote or a paraphrase of the quote, and then discussing it or analyzing it. And so thinking about the language arts portion of the GED specifically here, comparing two texts. So are there other ways to do it? Yeah, absolutely. Is this a good starting point? Could be. If they need help kind of getting things down and organizing and making sure that they are putting that evidence in there, because it is so important for that response. But if other students are working on something, maybe like English language learners in terms of like more maybe business English, or even thinking about how you know something, like this can have different forms. So again, feel free to take it, manipulate it, flexible, right? Is good. So and then the other one, if it's also very widely available on the internet, there are acronyms like CUPS and ARMS that kind of help remind students what they need to do in terms of revision and editing. Okay. All right, so almost out of time. I can't believe this. So here are a few for English as a second language. I'm going to spend my last 2 minutes on something else. So very quickly, I'm going to just jump ahead. So thinking about supports, and so two kinds, and this is my special education brain working here. So thinking about accommodations and modifications, but working with my adult learners, I just generally think about them as supports. I don't need to use the same kinds of language that I was using back when I was writing IEP documents. And so I just want to show you what this is going to look like. So when you see it, there are generally 4 types here: presentation, response, setting, and timing and scheduling. Okay, you can take a look at those definitions, but I'm going to jump ahead for a second. There are additional ways to support reading. I listed some of those things here. And then this is the part that I want to spend my last bit of time on. So here are some questions, okay? And as you're looking at these questions, if you're like, oh my gosh, that's my student, or she does this, okay, then here is a list of things that could be helpful, because the needs could be related to processing speed. And this can change. So I've had people come in and it may take them a very long time to do maybe a task, right? But as they get it, we're moving, and they don't necessarily need my supports anymore because they've internalized them. We are about to leave, but I'm going to jump ahead one more time. Second set of questions. And there's a second table that's 2 slides for working memory. There is a lot of overlap here. And again, just the idea of being flexible and figuring out how to be responsive to your learner is the most important thing. Okay. Does anybody have any questions, or if you want to put them in the chat real quick, or we can figure out a way so that I can answer them, even if it's just copying them to paper and then making sure that I get the responses posted somewhere. Well, it was very nice speaking with all of you. I hope you found this useful, and thank you for what you do.
I do not. Oh,
So the chat is now tutors are showing which one they want to go to. So okay.
somebody's recording this. You want to turn it off?